All right, friends, we'll talk briefly about the work that I've done in my own research, which was the basis of the article that you read from the Journal of Youth Ministry. In my work with college students for that project, for my dissertation project, and trying to help them think through what influences really helped them generate their understanding of sexuality, how they came to understand it, and then most specifically how churches and parents can create environments where kids can speak well and have healthy and positive conversations about sexuality. So that's really what we're going for here, and let's jump right in. I always start with this question of what are we talking about when we talk about sexuality. I'm going to show you these slides here really quickly. There's a definition from the World Health Organization. This one from Sarah Coakley, which is part of the reading that you did from her very, very good book on sexuality. And I show you both of those, or I show people both of those just to bring up the idea that sexuality is a huge conversation. There's a great deal to talk about. Again, the World Health Organization has all kinds of um, parts or all kinds of pieces of that definition. Coakley, of course, writes a whole book, as do many, many others, on trying to understand sexuality well. But it's much, much more than just attraction. It's much, much more than sexual behavior, sexual intercourse. It's a huge part of what it means to be human and who we are. So that's an entry point into this conversation. Is you have to start with knowing that it's a very large conversation. Biblically, it's a large conversation from the very beginning of the Bible to the very end of the Bible, and literally all in between. This is just a very small sample. God is talking about how we relate to each other sexually and what it means to be created in His image and created as part of His good creation to be sexual beings. So the Bible has a lot to offer us on what it means to be sexual people. Why come at this at all? And the church historically hasn't done it very well, and neither have Christian parents. And these are the problems that are forged by when we do not come at it, or that we're combating against by attempting to come to this conversation. First of all, is that the most common experience of every teenager is isolation, the feeling that nobody understands what's happening inside of me. That's built into what it means to form your identity and go through this journey that we call adolescence, as we discussed a little bit ago in the identity section of this module. So that's built in, and then you add on hormones and you add on, pardon me, sexual development. And every teenager essentially has this sense that nobody could possibly understand what's happening inside of me. And we want to come around them and say, no, we do. And we can't know exactly what's going on inside of you, but we get it. We've been there or somewhere very much like it before, or somebody here in the room has. So they don't have to feel like they're alone as they are trying to explore and understand what it means to be a sexual being. It's important that we come at this conversation with the idea and the knowledge, and because singleness is inevitable. In fact, singleness is the default way to live in America. The average American person won't get married until they're 30 years old. That means they've spent 18, 19 years after having started puberty, so as sexually aware people before they get married. And then, as you know, that most marriages don't stay together for the entire life of each person involved. A spouse may die, the marriage may end for some other reason, and people find themselves single again. And statistically, people are more likely to be single than they are to be married in their lifetimes in America. So we need to discuss with our people what it means to be single well, to steward our singleness and our bodies and our relationships well outside of marriage as well as inside of marriage. Probably don't have to say much about cultural saturation. Sexuality is absolutely everywhere, and we are thoroughly inundated with it in every aspect of the culture that we live in. I like to think of this idea of an evangelical manifesto, which is just a term that I made up, but I use that to say we're the people of God, and we're supposed to have some good news for the world about sexuality. And we need to start with our own people, with our own kids and our own church members, and give them good news about sexuality so that ultimately we can take it outside of our walls as well. The ultimate goal then is to create an environment. It's not to give you a set of things to say. It's not for you to give your parents a set of bullet points to talk about this, and this, although some of that can be helpful. The bigger goal, the more important goal, is to create space. where our kids can grow in their sexuality, where they can get real and honest information, they can ask the questions that are actually on their mind, and that where they can confess the times that they fail. So let's talk about how we create those environments. In my research, those environments had four main characteristics: that they were relational environments, environments of honesty, environments where things are consistently done, and where things are redemptive. And let's talk about each of those here for just a moment. In terms of being relational, that they're grounded in mutual vulnerability, or in uh, us sharing with each other our struggles and our thoughts. And even me as parent, or me as youth pastor, I share with my children or with the kids in my youth group. These are the times that I really struggled with my sexuality, where I really struggled to live as I felt like God was calling me to live, or perhaps I just flat out failed. And of course, you have to be wise in how much you reveal to your kids, or to the students you work with, or people in your church. But they need to get a sense that you've experienced this before, that you know what they're going through. They need other people in their lives to express that they know what they're going through as well. We need our conversations to be grounded in real life, to not rely on forced moments of having what most people would refer to as some form of the talk, which, by the way, doesn't work at all in any way. There's good research on that, um, but we talk about sexuality in every part of our lives. When our kids are young, we begin by calling their body parts by anatomical names, and not using pet names or cute names or funny names that uh, without saying it out loud, they teach our kids that we can't talk about these parts of ourselves. And if we can't talk about them as little kids, we sure enough can't talk about them as older kids, when things are even more unusual, or where things are even more rather uncomfortable. So we have this kind of implicit way of saying we're not going to talk about these parts of our body, and we have to stop that. We have to call our bodies by their actual names, and treat them as though they're part of normal life, because they should be part of normal life, because they're our bodies. That every moment of our lives that we live, we have to live within them. So we talk about sexuality in the real moments of life, when things come up, when we see things on television, when kids ask how babies got into mommy's tummies. We talk about sexuality in every moment when it comes up in normal life. And then we work through communication in a way that makes meaning. So it's not straight line information giving. It's not, I put a book on my kid's bed and hopefully they read it and learn something about sexuality. Please don't ever do that. It is instead sitting face to face, or sitting in a circle together and saying, we're going to try to figure this out together. And we're not going to be satisfied until you feel comfortable, at least for now, with what's going on in you, and what then the questions that you have about sexuality. And we'll have to come back to them later, but we just want you to feel comfortable for now, and going forward, and to feel like you've made some meaning of these questions going on inside of you. Oh, I meant to say that a little bit ago. A couple other thoughts on that relational aspect, that it's beneficial to include friends and mentors, to have friends around our students, especially our kids, who speak the same language, who understand the same things, or believe the same things about sexuality, and can help each other and support each other. And then have other mentors in their lives. And if you're a youth pastor, maybe you are that mentor. If you're a pastor, maybe you are. And that's a great role to fulfill, because so many times kids need a chance to say the things that they think is going to make the world explode before they tell their parents, which is who they really want to tell. So they'll come to you and they'll tell you. And if you react well, if you react in grace and in peace, then they'll feel like they can express those things perhaps to their parents. And as we said before, it's relational, because the worst possible feeling for an adolescent is feeling all alone, as though they're walking through this incredibly tumultuous time in their lives, and nobody understands what they're going through. So then we also want these spaces to be honest, and by honest we mean things like this: that we help our students resize sexuality. So some of the feedback I got in my own research was, people feel like the church has two very polar opposite views of sexuality. That either we view sexuality as essentially the only thing that matters. Like, the only thing that God is going to judge when he comes back is your sexuality. The only thing that determines if you're in or you can be out of the church is your sexuality. And we make so much of it that it just seems absolutely untenable. Or the church, on the other hand, never says anything about it. We act as though you're not a sexual being at all, like it's not part of human life or not part of Christian life to even consider questions of sexuality. And so, an honest space is a space where we say, sexuality is an important part of who we are. It's not all of who we are. It's not the source of our identity, for example, but it's a big part of it. Right? And so we treat it in the right context, in the right kind of sizing of what it means to be sexual people and created in God's image as sexual beings. So we approach difficult questions and difficult topics with honesty. And as a parent, sometimes that means I say, I don't know the answer to that question that my child asks. That I tell them I don't know, and we'll explore it together. We'll find out together. Um, but that we as church leaders, especially, we don't avoid hard conversations and difficult topics because those are the questions that people really need answers to. They all have the general sense that maybe we're not supposed to have sex till we get married and kind of a general morality idea. But those aren't the questions they need to ask. Right? The questions they need to ask are about the more difficult topics. And that, of course, brings us to the third bullet point there, which is we need space for our young people to ask questions. And every time that I do a unit on sexuality in the youth group, I create a mechanism that students can ask questions anonymously. Usually that's by giving everybody an index card, and at the end of a conversation, having every person in the room write something on the card, no matter what. Even if they don't have a question, they write a sentence, they write their name, they write a haiku, whatever. But the people who do have a question, they write those down. So everyone's turning in something. So it's not just one person dropping a question in a question box or anything like that, but some way to create space for young people to ask questions they really want answers to, and then a space where we can try to dialogue about those and answer those for them in the best way that we can. And then also an honest space is a space where we can struggle. Look, we're setting a bar of righteousness. We're setting a bar of being holy as Christ is holy. So of course we're all going to fail. I'm going to fail. You are going to fail. And any student that you talk to or in your church is going to fail somehow. And so we have to create space where we can be honest about that too. We want to be consistent, especially as churches. We want to be consistent across time. So, speaking with our young people about who they are as sexual beings from very, very early on in their lives, all the way through their life cycle, even as they get into the older years of their lives. Because it's not as though people stop being sexual beings when they hit a certain birthday. And then at the same time, consistent across people so that me, a parent, I'm saying particular things about sexuality. And then the youth pastor is saying things about sexuality, and the pastor is, and some other important adults and maybe who volunteer in the youth ministry, they're involved in that conversation. We're all talking in similar ways. We have shared language, we have shared ideas about sexuality. And of course, that only can develop when the church is talking about sexuality. That we circle back and we go deeper. So there's no one time to have a conversation about a topic, right? So I can't say to my 10-year-old son, this is what you need to know about sex when he's 10. I can say something. I can say this is something you can know about sex. But then when he's 15 and he's beginning to feel like he may want to start engaging in that world of sexual activity, we have to have very different conversations. And then when he gets into, I don't know, late teens or 20s, when he's starting to think about getting married, maybe we have more conversations about that because it means something different to him in each of those times. And so we can't just say, well, no, we already talked about that once before on any given topic. We keep circling back to those topics as they come up naturally in our lives and our relationships. And then I mentioned before, the whole church should be talking about sexuality somehow. In some way, because it's certainly not as though when people leave the youth group or the college group, all of a sudden there are no issues to be concerned with in sexuality. There are no temptations, there are no struggles, there are no failures, and yet we tend to resign that conversation, if it happens at all, to the younger people in our church populations. And then finally, it should be redemptive. It should be built on real foundations for biblical behavior, positive foundations, a positive casting of this is what could happen if you live out your sexuality well, as opposed to strictly a don't do this mentality or approach to sexuality. Sexuality is image bearing, especially singleness, as we mentioned before. That's such an incredibly important part and large chronological part of lifespan for most people now. A space where there's grace for failures, as I also mentioned before. If the bar is holiness, then we're all going to fail. So let's not act like that's unusual. Let's create space where that's expected, and so people can repent and they can be washed clean of that and move on from that in their lives. And then a space where everybody can come, where people who are struggling with their sexuality, or people who are struggling with lust, people who are struggling with pornography, they can come and they can be a part, and they can be welcomed, and they can be find the grace of Christ in the church, as that is, of course, the one place they should be able to find the grace of Christ. The very last interview that I did, after it was actually over, the young man named Derek grabbed my arm and said this, talking about church leaders, because that's where we ended the conversation. If you're not going to talk about sexual identity stuff, and by that he meant LGBT communicate or LGBT questions, you're wasting our time. He said those are the questions we're wrestling with. We don't need to know short's length. We're not worried about that anymore. We're worried about how do we handle these questions of our culture and in our lives and of our friends and even ourselves. And we're going to deal with that just a little bit at the end of this module. But as a church leader, we have to have some of those questions on the table as well as we get into conversations of sexuality.